Chapter 10. I didn't come out of my room until the dinner gong sounded. Not joining the others would have seemed suspicious, so I decided to act as normally as possible, but I found it difficult to look anyone in the eye. Fortunately, Willie and Cyclops were distracted by Miss Glass's grand entrance alongside me. She'd decided to dress in a gown more suited to dinner with royalty. The silver thread through the dark grey silk shone in the candlelight, and the pearls at her throat and in her hair only drove home to me that I was in the presence of aristocracy. Me, a humble watchmaker's daughter. Miss Steele? Mr. Glass's firm hand on my elbow caught me by surprise. May I escort you to your seat? Thank you. He folded my fingers over his arm and trapped them there with his own hand. Are you unwell? No. He bent his head toward mine. He smelled like spices and lavender, an intriguing combination that set my heart racing. You look a little pale, and you've been in your room most of the afternoon. Sometimes I like to be alone. So you weren't avoiding me? My heart rose to my throat. Why would I avoid you? He pulled out the chair for me. Because you believe me to be insincere? I would hazard a guess that you think me ungentlemanly too. His hand felt heavy on mine, but not unpleasantly so. You are a gentleman, Mr. Glass. Your grandfather was a baron, no less. I hope I'm more gentlemanly than he was. One side of his mouth kicked up. And please, don't hold my connections against me. I can't choose my family, but I do choose my friends very carefully. His breath ruffled my hair near my ear. I hope you will be one of them. Heat crept up my throat and touched my cheeks. His smile widened. He knew what effect his charm had on me, and that unsettled me more. Mr. Glass, in all honesty, I don't know what to make of you. My thoughts swing from one direction to the other every hour of the day, even when you're not present. He suddenly grinned. I'm glad to know that you think of me that often. I sucked in a steadying breath. Despite my determination to remain calm, it sounded ragged. Mr. Glass, are you flirting with me? Is that a crime? Some would say it is, since you plan on leaving England in a few days' time. Besides, haven't we already established that you're insincere? The muscles in his arm tightened. He let me go. My apologies, Miss Steele. I don't know what I was thinking. He strode off to the other side of the table and didn't look at me again. By the end of dinner, I felt hot and my nerves frayed, and I didn't know why. He'd done exactly what I'd wanted and ended his flirtations as a decent man, a gentleman, ought to have done. So why did part of me wish he hadn't? I couldn't sit still afterward in the library as I tried to read by the lamplight, so when Willie found me and asked if I was going to join her for cards, I agreed without hesitation. I needed to do something. A small voice told me I was being reckless, but I ignored it. I wanted to be reckless tonight. Hopefully, a little adventure would put an end to my restlessness. India's coming out with me, Willie announced to Mr. Glass after his aunt retired to her room. He lowered his brandy glass very slowly and deliberately. India? What happened to Miss Steele? She said I could call her India, so I will. Willie crossed her arms over her chest. I did, I said, although they seemed to have forgotten I was there. We three were alone in the drawing room where Willie and I found Mr. Glass reading the newspaper. Duke and Cyclops were nowhere to be seen. Miss Steele, would you mind stepping outside for a moment? I need to speak with Willie alone. I agreed, since I planned on listening in anyway. He shot me a hard smile, then shut the door on me. I placed my ear to it and listened to Mr. Glass rant at his cousin. "You are not taking her with you," he growled. "She's quite capable of making up her own mind," Willie retorted. "We're both grown women." "Grown women are as capable of getting themselves into trouble as girls. We're neither of us silly, Matt. If we sense danger, we'll leave." A moment's silence followed, in which I thought she'd won the argument already. Then he said, "I forbid it. She's not like you. She's not worldly. She damn well is, and if you can't see it, then you're not looking hard enough." "Worldly isn't the right word." A floorboard creaked and footsteps tapped before the floor creaked again. He paced across the room. "You're going into a room full of men who will be drinking and flush with money. Not after I fleece them. Willie, listen to me. Miss Steele isn't innocent. No, Matt, she isn't. She is, damn it." His vehemence surprised and confused me. Why was he being so fierce with Willie over this? "She presents herself as confident and resilient, but she's not. She's vulnerable and too trusting. You and I both know those are the qualities of an easy target." I stumbled away from the door, tears stinging my eyes. I wasn't sure what hurt more, that he thought I was weak and pathetic, or that he pitied me. Perhaps he was right, and I was the woman he described. I had trusted him in the beginning, after all. But I no longer wanted to be that person. I didn't want to be taken advantage of ever again. Eddie had taught me the error of blind trust. Nor would I be spoken about in such a manner. Mr. Glass didn't know me. I burst through the doors and stormed up to him. "You are very much mistaken, Mr. Glass. I'm not easy, nor am I a target, as you put it." He caught my arm as I moved away, pinning me against him. We were so close he must be able to feel my heart beating through his body. His dark eyes swirled like thunderous skies as they held me as thoroughly as his grip. "You shouldn't listen at doors, Miss Steele. It's not polite." "I think we are well past being polite to one another, don't you?" "Yes," he murmured. He lowered his face until it was only inches above mine. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. "Politeness be damned." Willie cleared her throat. Next thing I knew, she'd grasped my hand and I was being dragged out of the drawing room. "Don't wait up," she called out to her cousin. "You need your rest." I glanced back at him. He stood as rigid as a statue, his severe gaze on me as if he could will me to remain behind with just his glare alone. I smiled and waved at him. "Be home by 1, he snapped. 2, Willie said, already halfway out. 1. "Yes, Pa," Willie mocked. To me, she said, "We'll stay out till 3, eh?" "Watch and listen, but don't talk," said Willie as we approached a bootmaker's shop on Jermyn Street. "Don't utter a sound, frown, smile, or try to signal me in any way, even if you think I have the winning or losing hand." "How do I know what a winning or losing hand is?" "Don't roll your eyes, raise your brows, or chew your lip or the inside of your cheek." "May I breathe?" "If you must, but not huffily." My gaze slid to her, but it was difficult to see if she was being serious in the glow cast by the street lamps. While the lighting here was better than most streets, it still wasn't enough to cut through the thickening fog. I pulled my coat closed at my throat, but the chill settled into my bones anyway. It hadn't been a long walk from Park Street, and the area was the best in London, but I jumped at every sound. The rumble of passing carriages and the tap-tap of footsteps were eerily disembodied in the dense air, like ghostly beings passing by. Willie seemed perfectly composed as she led the way to the Jermyn Street shops. "Do you need new boots?" I asked as she knocked on the door of the bootmaker's shop. "This is the place," she announced. "Doesn't look like a gambling hell. Looks like an ordinary shop. That's because it is during the day. At night, the proprietor operates tables upstairs. A thick-necked man with a small mouth opened the door, nodded at Willie, then stared at me. I smiled and bobbed a curtsy. He continued to stare. With a click of her tongue, Willie said, "Anyone would think you ain't never seen a woman before, Pinch." "Not here, I ain't," he said. "Aye, you don't count." She wove around the displays of shoes and boots to a door at the rear of the shop where the scent of leather was stronger. She pulled on a shiny brass bell, and a clang responded from somewhere upstairs before another fellow opened the door. I turned back to see the first porter still staring at us. I hazarded a smile, and, to my surprise, he smiled back. The second porter didn't acknowledge us in any way. He was even burlier than the previous man. His jacket stretched over shoulders as large as boulders, and even his eyelids were thick with muscle. He took my presence in his stride and stepped aside so we could pass and climb the staircase, at the top of which was another door, reinforced with iron panels. A small lamp hung from a hook beside it, barely illuminating the top step. I had to feel my way up and take care not to trip. Masculine voices filtered out to us from the room beyond, mostly quiet, but twice cut through by a raucous laugh. I pressed my hand to my roiling stomach. It was too late to back down now. Willie was unlikely to walk home with me, and the thought of traipsing through the dark streets alone made me feel even sicker. "Where did you learn about this place?" I whispered as Willie knocked. "If you splash your money around at the hotels near the railway stations, someone flash will approach and tell you about a nice friendly place where you can drink with his friends and enjoy a quiet game of dice or cards." "You mean they go looking for likely gamblers?" "They do. I made sure to find the ones where poker is played. It weren't easy. Poker's not well known here in England." "What's poker?" "A card game." "Are you good at it?" Her white teeth flashed in the dimness. A narrow rectangular panel in the door slid open, and a pair of eyes peered at us. They widened ever so slightly upon seeing me, before the panel slammed shut. The door opened and a tall, slender fellow dressed like a gentleman greeted us. He nodded at Willie and she nodded back. We handed him our coats and hats. "Will you introduce me to your friend, Miss Johnson?" he inquired. "Miss Steele, this is Mr. Unger," she said as she looked past him. He bowed to me. "Welcome, Miss Steele. Have you come to play?" "Observe only," I said. "Are you the proprietor of this establishment?" "No." He didn't elaborate and merely stepped aside so we could pass. Smoke rose in slender columns from a dozen cigars. It clung to the beams, disturbed only by the occasional draught. Gentlemen sat at tables, their concentration on the rolling dice or cards in their hands. Chairs clustered around some of the tables in the windowless room, and a door on the far side led to a second room. The fireplace was unlit, but the air felt cloying. Men dressed in crimson waistcoats and crisp white shirts stood at each table and seemed to be in charge of the play. The one at the hazard table held a hooked stick. Willie headed to a table of card players to the left and took a spare seat. But it was several seconds before the hum of voices quieted. One by one, all the men turned to me until 18 pairs of eyes focused entirely on my person. Clearly, women dressed as women were an oddity in their den. I bobbed an awkward curtsy and hurried after Willie. She chuckled and shook her head at me. The fellow in charge of her table found me a chair, and the portly, middle-aged gentleman next to her made space for me to squeeze in. "Good evening, miss," he said with a gap-toothed smile. "It's not often we're graced with such gentle company." Willie muttered something under her breath that I didn't quite catch. "I'm here in an observational capacity only," I assured him. "Like our other new friend tonight." He pointed his cigar at the gentleman sitting directly opposite me. "Seems poker is becoming all the rage in London now. I can see why. Jolly good game." His rolling laugh filled the room. It must have been his laughter that I'd heard from outside. No one else seemed in such a jovial mood. Most likely because he had the largest stack of money in front of him. The other observer nodded at me with a friendly smile, and I nodded back. Then we both concentrated on the game. "5-card cowboy stud," said the dealer to Willie as he dealt. The man next to me leaned closer. "What do you know about this great American game, Miss—" "Steele," I said. "I know nothing about it." "Name's Travers." He placed a monocle into his eye socket and studied his cards, then turned his scrutiny onto me. He scanned me from head to toe, then shifted his chair even closer. He smelled like cigars and brandy. "You don't sound American." "I'm English." A pretty young English rose. Perfect." Clearly the lighting wasn't very good if he thought me pretty and young. "Thank you," I said, nevertheless. "Has your friend taught you to play?" he asked, nodding at Willie. "No, we've only just met." He squinted at me through his monocle. "You're not a hustler, are you?" "A what?" "A confidence man or woman who pretends not to know the rules, then fleeces everyone at the table." "I assure you, I don't know how to play poker. Whist is more my game." He chuckled and the monocle fell onto the table. He returned it and studied his cards again before plucking a single coin off his pile and placing it beside the others. "She fleeced me last night," he said with a nod at Willie. "But I think I know her ways now." Willie smirked. "Then I wish you luck, my lord." "Lord?" I stared at Travers, but he was engrossed in the game and paid me no mind. I caught the gaze of the newcomer opposite, and he shrugged. His bright blue eyes sparkled with intelligence. I watched several rounds and thought I'd worked out which combination of cards constituted a winning hand. Then everything I'd learned was thrown upside down when the lord beside me won with nothing more than a pair of 8s. Willie watched him rake in his winnings with a scowl on her face. "Why did he win?" I whispered. "You had a pair of 3s and 6s." "He was bluffing. I folded too early." She picked up one of her coins and rubbed its surface with her thumb as if she was trying to remove the queen's face. She seemed in no mood to answer any more of my questions. Lord Travers draped his arm across the back of my chair and leaned so close I could hear his moist smile. "My dear girls, why not call it a night? This is no place for lovely roses. With thorns might prick you." His guffaw had heads at the other tables turning. "Speaking of pricks," one gentleman muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. A sprinkle of laughter filled the room, led by Travers himself. He won the next 2 rounds, much to Willie's annoyance. She tossed her cards into the middle of the table and sat back in the chair, arms folded over her chest. She was down to her last 5 shillings. "Your friend doesn't like to lose," Travers said in my ear. I swayed away from him. "I'm quite sure nobody likes to lose." Willie's flinty glare slid towards him. She hunched over the table and scooped her coins toward her like a protective mother cat. Lord Travers chuckled. His fingers skimmed my shoulder up to the bare skin above my collar. I shivered and recoiled. "Would you care for a drink, ladies?" asked the blue-eyed gentleman who'd suddenly appeared between Willie and me. He addressed me, but his hard gaze fell upon Travers at my other side. Why not join me in the refreshments room, miss? All this poker is making my head spin. Thank you. I put out my hand. I think I will. He led me away from the table. Willie didn't seem to notice that I'd left, and even Travers didn't seem to care all that much. He simply returned his monocle to his eye and studied the new hand he'd been dealt. The gentleman steered me to the adjoining room where sandwiches and little cakes were set out on the table. A long white tablecloth edged with lace draped to the lushly carpeted floor. Decanters and glasses stood ready on a sideboard, their crystal facets glinting in the candlelight cast by the overhead chandelier. "Brandy?" he asked. "Wine? Sherry?" "Brandy. Thank you for your gallant rescue, sir. I appreciate it." He smiled at me over his shoulder. Although he wasn't a strikingly handsome man, he had a friendly smile and clear blue eyes. I guessed him to be in his mid-30s, going by the lines fanning out from the corners of his eyes and stretching across his forehead. "I'm at your service. Miss Steele, was it?" I nodded and joined him at the sideboard. "My name is Dorchester." He poured 2 brandies from a decanter and handed one of the tumblers to me. "To your health, Miss Steele." I sipped and eyed him over the rim of the glass. "Have you learned anything tonight, Mr. Dorchester?" "I've learned not to play poker with Lord Travers." "He does seem to win a lot." "And have roaming hands." "Your friend is an interesting character. Did I catch an accent?" "Willie's American." He made a face. "You don't like Americans?" I asked. "I've only met 2 and they were somewhat brash, boastful fellows. They lacked polish and sophistication, if you know what I mean." I simply smiled. While Willie and Duke certainly fit that description, Mr. Glass didn't, and I wasn't yet sure what to make of Cyclops. "What brings you to this gambling house?" "Gambling?" He grinned. I'd heard about this new game of poker and decided to see what it was all about. I admit that I enjoy the thrill of winning, but I'm cautious too. I never wager more than I can afford to lose. Hence the evening spent observing rather than participating. "Indeed. And you, Miss Steele? Are you planning on returning to try your hand at poker another night?" "I don't gamble." I had nothing to wager with, but even then I couldn't see the appeal. "Perhaps you'll simply come and keep your American friend company again. It would make the evening more interesting if you were here." He smiled again. Heat crept up my face. I sipped to hide it. "Are you from London, Mr. Dorchester?" He shook his head. "I studied here in my youth, but reside in Manchester. I'm in manufacturing." "Oh, your accent sounds pure London to me, and upper class at that." "So I've been told. I must have picked it up years ago." He sipped. "So tell me how a nice English girl winds up at a gambling den with an American woman who dresses like a man." I laughed. "It's a long story. I have all night." "Don't you want to return to the poker table?" "Not when there is a more interesting option." Those lovely blue eyes fixed on me, and my face flamed. I searched for something to say, but could only smile pathetically and sip my brandy. I was saved from responding by 2 men who joined us at the sideboard. They sported the cocky swagger of youth dipped in privilege and money. One poured drinks and the other, more portly fellow, helped himself to the cakes. The one with the drinks leaned back against the sideboard and downed the contents of one of the glasses. "What's your name?" he asked me. "Miss Steele," I said. His pale grey gaze slipped over me, lingering on my chest, my throat, my mouth. His top lip curled into an indolent smile. "I'll double whatever he's paying," he said with a jerk of his head at Mr. Dorchester. I blinked. "Pardon?" He rolled his eyes. "Don't pretend innocence, Miss Steele. It's not going to earn you anything more with us." "Us?" I glanced at his companion. He sneered, but thanks to the dusting of sugar on his lips, it didn't seem quite as sinister as his friend's. Even so, I knew what these men wanted and what they thought I was selling. I backed away. "You're mistaken, sir," I said with as much courage as I could muster. "I'm not what you think I am." "Course you are. Why else would you be here?" "Why, indeed?" Mr. Dorchester stepped between the gentleman and me. He was shorter by a full head, but strongly built, where the other man was slender and wiry. "Kindly leave Miss Steele alone." "I'm not paying a penny more," the gentleman snarled. "Your doxy isn't worth the double I'm offering." Before my gasp had left my lips, Mr. Dorchester grabbed the man's coat at his chest and lifted him clear off his feet. The fellow swung his fist, but missed. Mr. Dorchester threw him bodily against the wall. A moment later, Unger rushed in, and at least a half-dozen gamblers crowded in the doorway behind him. More than one sniggered at the dazed-looking fellow on the floor. "India?" I could hear Willie before I could see her. She managed to push through the small crowd and rushed up to me. She clasped my forearms and searched my face. "What happened? You all right?" "Quite, thank you." My hands shook, my heart pounded, but I wouldn't admit that to Willie. I was unharmed after all, and the danger was over now. She blew out a long breath and checked me over once again. "Thank God. Matt would haul me over hot coals if something happened to you." Mr. Dorchester looked up sharply, then away. He scratched his jaw, but stopped suddenly and dropped his hand to his side. It was as if he didn't know what to do with it, or with himself, now that all eyes were on us both. Willie eyed the fellow slumped groggily on the floor. "What happened?" "Mr. Dorchester defended my honour against that man," I said. Willie grunted. "Your honour?" Mr. Dorchester straightened his tie. "It's impolite to call a lady a doxy." "A doxy?" Willie hooted with laughter and kicked the shoe of the fellow on the floor. "Are you blind, sir? She's tied up tighter than a miser's purse strings. Wait till I tell Duke and Cyclops they'll laugh till their sides split." I thrust my hand onto my hip. "And Mr. Glass? Will you tell him?" Her grin faded. "Best not to tell him, unless you don't want to come here again." At that moment, I didn't care if I never set foot in this gambling house or any other again. I'd wanted to be a little reckless and experience something I'd never done before, but staying in with a good book now seemed more appealing. "This is why you should forbid women," one of the gamblers said to Mr. Unger. "They cause trouble." "I'll have to ask you to leave, sir," said Mr. Unger to Mr. Dorchester. "No fisticuffs, house rules." Mr. Dorchester held up his hands. "I understand." "He was protecting me," I protested. "You should ask that fellow to leave. He started the trouble." "Lord Denison and Mr. Friars Smythe are regulars here." He nodded at the friend who'd set aside his cake to help his companion to his feet. "They've caused no problems prior." "It's quite all right, Miss Steele," said Mr. Dorchester. "I don't think poker is for me, and there are other gambling dens in the city willing to take my money." "But it's not fair," I said. "You don't deserve this treatment." He took my hand between both of his. "I'm tired anyway. May I be so bold as to suggest you leave now too, for your own safety?" "Not yet," Willie said before I could respond, her mouth set into a determined line. "I need to win back what I lost first." "Or lose more," called Mr. Travers from the other room. "Mr. Dorchester is right," I said. "We should go." Willie seemed not to hear me. She marched back to the gambling room and resumed her seat at the poker table. She tapped her finger on the surface. "Deal." "Would you like me to escort you home?" Mr. Dorchester asked as the others returned to their seats. While the offer was tempting, I refused. I didn't know him well enough to walk alone with him in the dark. "I'll wait for Willie." Very well, but do be careful, Miss Steele. I'd hate to think of anything happening to you. He bowed. It's been a pleasure making your acquaintance. I hope we meet again. He collected his hat, coat and gloves and spoke quietly to Mr. Unger, perhaps seeking assurance from him that I wouldn't come to any harm. Mr. Unger glanced at me, then nodded, and Mr. Dorchester left. I was sorry to see him go, not because I missed his company, but because it meant I ought to remain in the gambling room and not retire to the refreshment room. The fellow who'd called me a doxy, Lord Denison, had fully recovered. He sauntered out too, a glass in hand, and leaned a hip against the roulette wheel. His cold eyes watched me and his lips twisted. I shivered again. Lord Travers patted the empty chair beside him. "Come, sit by me, Miss Steele. I'll keep you warm." "I prefer to stand," I said, and moved to the hearth behind Willie's chair. They played a few rounds, with either Lord Travers or Willie winning most hands, even when they lacked good cards. I couldn't tell when either of them was bluffing, but Lord Travers seemed to have Willie's measure. He also had more winning card combinations. I grew bored, so I picked up the carriage clock on the mantel. It was running perfectly well, but I removed its casing and inspected its mechanisms anyway. I ran my thumb over the wheels, feeling comfort in the familiar parts and their small yet precise movements. The metal warmed to my touch. I would have taken it apart and put it back together again for something to do, but I didn't have my tools with me. I replaced the back casing and returned it to the mantel. After half an hour, the other two players on the poker table retired, having lost everything, and Lord Travers possessed most of the money. Willie was down to her last coins, and I found myself hoping she would lose so we could go home. According to the clock, it was 2:30. I wanted to go to bed. My heart sank when I saw the 3 tens in her hand. A winning hand now would keep her here longer. She pondered her cards for some time, then pushed all of her coins forward. Lord Travers matched her wager without hesitation and added an entire stack more. Willie couldn't possibly meet it. She lifted her brows at Mr. Unger, who'd come to watch. He shook his head. "I'm sorry, Miss Johnson, but the bank only lends money to patrons well known to us. If you return to America, we have no way to get our funds back." She swore under her breath. Lord Travers chuckled. "Surely you have something of value that you can wager, Miss Johnson?" He licked his fleshy lips, wetting them even more. "Or your friend does?" Surely he didn't mean me. I recoiled. "Willie, it's time to go." But I may as well have not been present. She didn't seem to hear me. She passed her hand over her chin, down her neck, and let it rest on her décolletage. Lord Travers leered at me. The gamblers at the other tables had all stopped and now watched us with interest. The fellow who'd called me a doxy ambled over and leaned down to Travers' level to whisper in his ear. Travers snickered and licked his lips again. "Come now, Miss Johnson," he said. "Where's that American pluck you displayed the past few nights? You're not a coward, are you?" Willie bristled. "Course not." I pressed Willie's shoulder. "You don't have any more money," I hissed. "Let's go." "I have this." She pulled out a chain from beneath her shirt, at the end of which dangled a gold locket the size of a farthing. "My grandmother gave it to me before she died. It was her wedding present from her grandfather. It's all I have of them." Travers looked disappointed. "Sure you want to wager it?" Willie hesitated, then nodded. She held it out for Travers to inspect. He weighed it in his palm before opening it and inspecting the miniatures inside. "A handsome couple. I accept." "Willie, is that wise?" I whispered. "What if you lose it?" "I won't lose." Lord Travers placed the locket with Willie's coins and rested his hand on the seat next to his thigh. "We'll see, shall we?" He returned both hands to his cards, fanning them out on the table. Full house. I'd not seen that combination of cards all night, but I knew it must be good. Willie's white face confirmed it. She looked like she would faint as she stared hard at her own cards, perhaps willing them to be better. With a click of her tongue, she threw her cards on the table. She stood, shoving back her chair. "You cheated." Lord Travers laughed as he scooped his winnings toward him. Willie's locket glinted in the light. Now, Miss Johnson, don't be a sore loser." "You cheated," she shouted again. "You had a card under your leg. I saw you remove it and add it to your hand." Travers slipped the locket into his dinner jacket pocket. "What rot. Did I cheat, gentlemen?" The other gamblers shook their heads. "Stand up," Willie growled. "You must have placed the card you removed from your original hand somewhere. Let's see under your fat ass." "Willie," I tugged on her arm, but she shook me off. "Please, let's go." "Listen to your friend, Miss Johnson." Travers collected the cards on the table and shuffled them. "Be a good girl and go home before you say something you regret." He stopped shuffling and eyed me. "Unless you're willing to wager something else." I straightened. "That's quite enough of that. You may be a lord, but your behaviour is deplorable, as is yours, sir." I spat at Lord Dennison. Travers laughed around the cigar in his mouth, sending ash onto his lap. "Hear that, Dennison? The little chit thinks she can lecture us. She deserves a good spanking to be put back in her place." I gasped and looked to Mr. Unger for assistance, but he merely shrugged an apology. I would get no help from him. Travers was worth too much to his business to risk offending him, and Mr. Dorchester, my only champion, was gone. I grabbed Willie's arm. "Let's go, now." But she didn't move. She bared her teeth and pointed her finger at Travers. "You're a low-down, dirty cheat, and I will prove it. Stand up." Travers sprawled in his chair and grinned around his cigar. "Make me, little girl." "Oh, I will, with the help of my friend, Mr. Colt." Willie jerked her coat aside and pulled out the gun tucked into the waistband of her trousers. Several men fell back, bumping into one another in their haste to remove themselves from the vicinity, but no one left the room. All were glued to the scene. "Willie, no!" I cried. "Don't!" But I might as well have not spoken. "Stand up, Travers," she said. He placed his hand on the seat near his thigh again. "It's my lord to you, miss, and no, I will not." "For God's sake, move!" I shouted at him. "She will use it." "I'm not afraid of a girl," Travers said with a chuckle. Willie squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. She frowned and inspected the cylinder. She spun it round and round. It was empty. Damn him! My heart sank. Mr. Glass must have removed the bullets after the shooting episode of the previous night. I wanted to swear as loudly as Willie. While I didn't want her to shoot anyone, we now had no weapons to defend ourselves. And the men knew it. They advanced. Lord Dennison and his friend, Smythe something or other, grinned like madmen and approached with slow, predatory steps. Dennison rubbed his crotch. Travers sat back and watched, smiling with those fishy, wet lips of his. "That's it, gentlemen," he said, chomping down on his cigar. "Teach them how to respect us." "On your knees," Dennison ordered, pointing at me. He fumbled with the opening of his trousers, and his tongue darted out to lick his top lip. His companion wiped beads of sweat from his brow. His breathing became ragged. I glanced at the men behind them, but none came to our aid. All watched with keen interest. This nightmare couldn't be happening. Surely I would wake up soon. My weak knees were very real, however, and so were the men leering at us with lust in their eyes. I touched Willie's hand. Her fingers curled around mine and gripped hard. My heart plunged to my toes. I'd hoped she had something up her sleeve, but it would seem the gun had been her only security guard. Without it, she was as vulnerable as me. We were 2 women up against more than a dozen men, and she was as terrified as me. We didn't stand a chance.